Howdy, everyone. This is Kyle Chambers here for your QMS Bootcamp from Texas Quality Assurance. Now, just because we're on YouTube, this is the thing you have to do, right? So if you have not already, be certain to subscribe to the channel. We've got tons of great content on here, several previous QMS Bootcamp videos, start from the Quality Matters podcast, Business Visionaries Book Club, and our Quality Minute videos. So if you're looking to get some help in just a very short amount of time, we've got some really short, quick, helpful videos for you to get there. But enough of that. Let's talk about our topic today. Today, we are talking about why on earth are there so many standards. So we work commonly with several of these, but there's really no shortage of quality and compliance standards out there. And something I've had folks ask me before is, because I say all the time, quality is quality. It really is. Say what you're going to do it. Plan out some of the basics of the key processes you have. So if that's true, why so many standards? Well, there's some good reason and some not so good reason for some of it, but we'll dive into that. So I'm going to throw up my screen here for just a moment. And what we're taking a look at here, this is actually an excerpt from our formal QMS Bootcamp training. This is a 4-day training course. Prior to the COVID lockdown and shutdown, we used to conduct these in person in public events. So we're looking at doing that again. Not just yet, trying to figure out the logistics to make it happen. But this is excerpt from that material. So what we're talking about here is, this is from integrating with other systems, part 4 of the day 4 of our training. So again, why do we have so many? We'll dig into it. We'll understand a little bit more. So for those of you that may be or maybe aren't familiar with all of these different standards, really the big one that everyone knows about is ISO 9001. Now, ISO 9001 is your standard quality management system. I tell people often, it is effectively common sense written by lawyers. So sometimes the verbiage is a little hard to grasp, and sometimes it goes on for 3 or 4 lines to make a very simple point. But effectively, it's common sense written by a lawyer. So what do I mean by that? Well, we've got common parts of the standard. Let's just go ahead and take a look real quick. Why not? Let's look directly at the standards. Let me drag this over into view here. There we go. All right. So we have our ISO 9001 standard. Let me make that a little bigger there. Now, this is from 2015. So this is now actually a bit of an older edition. It is the latest and greatest edition. Folks ask if they're coming up with a new version sometime soon. The answer is going to be yes, and we'll talk a little bit about why. But I wouldn't expect to see it for a couple of years. Don't quote me on that, but I wouldn't expect to see anything till early as 2023 for a new edition of the standard. Previously, they had the 2008 edition that was replaced by the 2015 edition. So we're kind of on track for that to happen again. But let's just kind of see what's in it here, So let's zoom out a bit. There we go. And let's look at the contents here. Now, this is actually something we're going to focus on a fair amount today. This is one of the things I do like about some of the newer changes to the ISO standards and the way that ISO is an organization, because it is the International Standards Organization. Kind of the way that they're moving things is through what they call their Annex SL model. Annex L model kind of depends on where you read and when you read. But they do something really fun in it, is that all of these clauses line up together. So clause 1 and clause 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way through 10 are all effectively the same between standards. So if we take, 9001 for quality management, but if we take the health and safety management standard, ISO 45001, we see here some fun stuff. That clause 5, leadership and worker participation, correlates to leadership in our quality management system. So it really, really makes it a lot easier. The first time that I actually put together a management system, we were working with ISO 9001 written in one format, ISO 14001 written in another format, and the 14001, for those who don't know, is the environmental management system standard. And we were implementing a health and safety management system as well. But our friend over here, ISO 45001, oh, where is it? Yes, here it is, wasn't a thing yet. So what did we have? We had OSAS 18001. This is a British standard, accomplishes the same goal as 45001, but British standard rather than ISO standard. And we see here there are only 4 clauses, but the clause 4 here gets really quite detailed. So it used to be a very fun, shall I say, process to map. Well, we have clause 4.2 of 45001, and that's going to map to clause, oh, what are we at here? And you scroll and you look, and oh, so that's going to map over here in leadership for our quality policy. Like, it becomes a mess, an absolute mess. So there's some good going on here. So if you ever hear me refer to standards as the big 3, what I mean by the big 3 are ISO 9001, ISO 14001, ISO 45001. These are effectively the same standard. There are differences, but the difference is in identifying who our customer is. Now, I say customer using the term a little loosely here, but who's our customer? Who do we care about? What do we care about? What's the focus here? So if we take a look at the 9001 standard for quality management, what we care about is our product and service quality and how we're meeting customer requirements. Outside of that, we then care about our interested parties, legal requirements, things of that nature. We touch on those a little, but not a lot. When we move over to 45001, what we're looking at is our worker safety, our interested parties safety, contractors, customers, visitors, you name it. We're looking at their safety. So how well can we provide a fantastically safe workplace? Now, some folks in the safety world will think what I'm about to say is heresy. Do not overinterpret. But safety is not first, nor could it be, nor should it be. Because let's be honest, if safety was first, we'd all be sitting at home in a bubble. Kind of sounds a little bit like something from the last 12 months, but I digress. So doesn't mean safety isn't important, but we have to understand that safety becomes integrated with our production systems. So we have to find a way for these to work together. For that reason, we very, very strongly recommend folks to integrate their health safety management system, their environmental management system with their quality management system. By doing so, you're able to reconcile so many of these conflicts that oftentimes really plague our organizations. And you wind up with these battles of competing ideologies, competing priorities, where really, if we can integrate these things into a more comprehensive management system, we're going to be able to say what really matters, address our risks at each phase of the process, and really provide a better value to our people, our surrounding neighborhood, and our customers. But those are the reason for these 3 standards. And that's pretty easy to understand. For folks that haven't, again, gone into too much detail with these, let's take a look a little bit more at some of the things that are the same, some of the things that are different. So we're just going to look at 45001 and 9001 for today's sake. But if any of you are interested in doing a comparison between all 3 of the big 3 or more detail elsewhere, let me know. Leave a comment below, email me. We'll have fun talking about it. So let's take a look here. Let's go in 45001, health and safety. Let's talk about planning. So in planning, we care about actions to address risk and opportunities. That kind of sounds like what we have over here in our quality side on 9001. It's actions to address risk and opportunities, but we're changing our focus. Remember, in quality, we care about the product quality and our customer satisfaction. In 45001, we care about our workers' safety and their satisfaction with that safety and their engagement with that safety process. So we go into a little more detail here for identification of hazard and assessments of risk and opportunities. Whereas with quality, I mean, let's be honest, a lot of those individual risks and opportunities are identified, but they're identified later, more involved in the production process, as opposed to a very upfront formal planning process. And this makes sense. If we're responding to changes on the fly, so to speak, with safety, that's a terrible situation. Someone's life is at stake. If we're responding to changes on the fly with production quality, okay, still not the greatest thing to do, but really the worst thing that would happen is we wind up being late on a delivery, which still not good, but a lot better than someone dying. So on the health and safety side, we care a lot more about analysis of our risks up front. But otherwise, we're looking at effectively the same standard. So if you're already comfortable with 9001, you will find that you're very quickly comfortable 45,001 and 14,001. Just understand that we're shifting the focus from production and service quality and customer satisfaction to our health and safety, or to our local environment and our legal requirements. Well, we'll sample a couple other sections here. So 45,001, health and safety. We're talking about resources, competence, awareness. Communication gets to be a very, very, very big thing in health and safety. 9001, I mean, we kind of care about communication, but it's not as big of a deal, right? But we care a lot more about documented information. And let's be honest here, documented information from the quality aspect is more vital than detailed documented information from the safety perspective. Safety perspective, we're going to likely have some standard things, right? We're going to have a procedure. We're going to have some hazard assessments, maybe a job safety analysis if you're working in different locations or have to do a pre-shift review. We're going to have some standard processes for like confined workspaces, hot work, so forth. But these are fairly static. They don't change a whole lot unless you do a JSA, in which case it's a little different for each job. But with the production side, we've got many, many, many more specific specifications, requirements depending on the product, the customer, so forth. So that makes sense why we see a little bit of the difference here. But again, if you understand one standard, you really quickly are able to pick up and grasp the others. Now, this is something a lot of consultants aren't going to tell you. Why? Because they'd much rather, and don't get me wrong, I love charging for it as well. It's a great way to provide for our team and families and everything, but they want you to remain very confused. So if you're implementing a system on your own, if you got one understood, you're going to have a lot easier time with the other two. But these are kind of the same, right? They're all laid out the same. This is easy. Well, what are some other standards that we have? So let's go into the presentation here and throw that up. Boom, there we go. All right. So we talked a little bit about NXSL. It's a good thing. Now, what's bad about NXSL is they really complicated the language, right? So some oddball concepts like risk-based thinking. Risk-based thinking was not a term until NXSL introduced it into our standards. I've got other videos on that. Feel free to check those out. Control of externally provided sources, right? Or providers. Well, these are suppliers, vendors. We used to have one word. Now we got 5 words. Some of the things that changed. So we got some good. We got some bad. But all in all, it's a big improvement on what we used to have. Now, I promise you that we talk a little bit about why there are so many standards. So, and we're getting there. But we've got these big 3, and these 3 really make sense. I mean, these are the 3 we talk about all the time. We don't want to dump anything bad into the environment. We don't want anyone to get hurt. And we want to provide a top quality product and service so that we can continue to provide for those people that we keep safe and for our families at home. All makes sense. But industries change, and everyone is out to make a buck. Not a bad thing, but it does mean that sometimes we get introduced to additional complexities. So let's take a look at that. Let me pull up my API spec over here. Give me a moment. Da-da-da. All right. Sorry. Sometimes getting the zoom and the scroll right on these things is a little more difficult. So what we're looking at here is the API spec Q2. So Q2 is an API specification. API is the American Petroleum Institute. Now, API has many specifications for all sorts of individual oil and gas, oil field equipment, so that we can ensure standardization across the board. So even if you have two different manufacturers making the same product, if they're both monogrammed for that same product, you can have some assurance of interchangeability. Great stuff. It's what made the Industrial Revolution happen in the first place, and it's still going on today. Standardization is fantastic. Now, the Q1 and Q2 specs, let's talk about those briefly. So Q1 is your general quality management system for oil and gas. We're looking at oil and gas manufacturers primarily for Q1, although realistically the requirements can be applied elsewhere. The Q1 standard used to carbon copy text from ISO 9001, and then they add their extra thou shalls to it. So an example would be for calibrated equipment. ISO says you have to track it, has to be internationally traceable. Then they kind of stopped there. API came in and gave additional requirements for the oil field. Now, some of these requirements are good and valid. Some of these requirements allow API to publish a standard and API to charge for API trainings and API monograms at their rate and maintain the profits, as opposed to these external certification bodies and registers. So there's both good reasons and, well, sometimes for the end user, not so good reasons for these multiple standards. But let's take a look. Let's see what the Q2 standard has to say briefly. So Q2 is for oil field services. Some things you need to know about Q2 is it begins to care a lot more about contingency plannings, worst case type scenarios, whereas ISO 9001 doesn't even touch it. ISO 45001 very briefly does. We have to identify our emergency action plans, but beyond that, they don't really care that much about these type contingency plans. But we see here, this is a specification for quality management systems, requirements for service supply organizations in the oil and gas world. All right. Well, let's see if we can get to the table of contents here. It's where we're going to find the good stuff we're looking for. Now, we saw in ISO, we have 10 clauses. We got 6 here. So it makes mapping the requirements a little more difficult sometimes. But really, we're looking at the same stuff. So we've got our management system requirements, management responsibility. Well, you know, over here, we kind of have the same thing. We've got leadership. Okay. So different terminology, but same idea. Organization capability. Well, over here in ISO, we talk about that. We call it context of the organization. Where do we fit in? What do we do? How do we kind of interact and work with the rest of the world? Kind of same idea. All right. So Q2, we care a lot about risk assessment management. We really care about risk here. ISO 9001 is just kind of tossing a bone out there for risk. We have to have risk-based thinking. All right. But we can see how we can map these. Now, I keep talking about map them. Well, let me explain why you got to map these things. So we had a customer recently ask us this question. They are going for, we're considering AS 9100. Now, AS 9100 is the aerospace equivalent to ISO 9001. Now, this client of ours, they have an existing ISO 9001 certification, and they use this in their sales and marketing efforts quite often, and it's done a lot to help them get and drive more business, as well as, of course, maintain their existing level of quality and so forth. But they have a couple of aerospace clients that they were looking at, which this happened a lot last year when oil and gas sunk. Well, some of these more precision facilities or facilities working in various electronics components and so forth, really, especially with the precision machine shops, is they said, well, who else can we market to? And so what they found is that there was another industry, the aerospace industry, that was looking to have similar type work done, at least to the same tolerances and specifications and so forth. So they were looking at getting their AS 9100 certification. And so we went through and identified, what are some of the gaps in there, and, what's really going to be required to get AS 9100. And so what we really identified is that 9001 requirements are pretty well encapsulated in 9100. And so the manager was excited. He said, great, we don't have to keep paying for our 9001 certification. All we need is our AS 9100 once we go for it. And I said, yes, but, and the but is, there's so many standards. You have to keep in mind that these standards are, yes, for you and your organization to maintain quality and control in your organization, but these standards are fantastic sales and marketing tools as well, because when you're going to get new business, you're able to say, look, folks over here do the same thing that we do. We have gone to the effort of getting this certification. We can show that we've been evaluated by an objective third party and can do the work for you. Fantastic. But if the person in the supplier department, the purchasing department, does not know what AS 9100 is, and they have a checkbox for ISO 9001, or they have a checkbox for API Q1, Q2, 9100 doesn't fit that checkbox. So you could actually wind up causing some difficulty there. So make sure that these are things that are kind of considered. But again, these are some of the reasons that we have multiple standards. So let's take a look back here at the Q2 standard. So we have, a requirement for purchasing, contingency planning, design and development. These are all very similar to 9001. But again, they go into more detail that's more industry specific, the same way the AS 9100 standard is very industry specific. So again, there are some really good reasons that are helpful to you for having these multiple standards. And unfortunately, there are some reasons that are very helpful to the publishing companies that make these standards. Little bit of both going on. But let's go on here. So move to the next slide here. So we covered the details Annex SL. So let's look at some of the others that are kind of out there. All right, so we talked about API Q1, right? So API Q1 is really for the manufacturing world, API in the oil and gas market. Very, 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 very similar to 9001. In fact, when we conduct an internal audit, we generally spend the same number of days on a 9001 audit as we would a Q1 audit. Now, oftentimes, so if folks have their API certifications, they also have monograms for specific products they manufacture, right? So maybe it's a certain type of threading, maybe they do Christmas trees, or you name it. So they may have that additional monogram in there. And having the Q1, Q2 standards are a prerequisite for getting those monograms. We run into the same situation with ASME world, right? So ASME, ASME, depends on who you talk to, how they say it, is the American Society for Mechanical Engineers. So ASME, what they do is they work with kind of the same thing, but for a little bit different end of the spectrum. So the most common ASME certifications you'll see are for like your R and U stamps, and these are for pressure systems. So if you've got some boilers or some tanks or your main water pressure, you'll oftentimes wind up looking to get your ASME stamp for one of these. Now, ASME does have quality management requirements, but they are very, very, very light. What they do have are a lot of requirements for quality control, for specification, for design requirements. Now, for those to be successful, you still kind of have to manage the things at the top properly, but they do address it very differently from the other standards. Some other common ones that we have in here, ISO 13485. This is for medical devices. So last year we saw the same thing with some of the machine shops. They went from working in the oil field, precision equipment that's going down hole miles below the ground, right? Very, very critical that these are made well. Well, they found that they had a market in medical devices, because let's face it, if you're going to get something implanted into your body, you want to know it's going to be good. So ISO 13485, very, very similar to 9001, but with some additional requirements in there. One of those requirements is a requirement for validation, right? So if you're going to, in 9001, we have the design clause in 8.3. One of the requirements of design and development is to validate the design when you're finished. But beyond that, we're not doing validation. ISO 13485, validation is a critical component for every component of your management system, because they are not going to allow you to interject a new tool or system into your management system without first validating that it's going to work well. So we've got some different changes in there. AISC, American Institute of Steel Construction. Kind of the same way that ASME goes, is it's a little more light on the quality management, the quality assurance side on the top. So not as many requirements for your standard process procedures, but then gets very, very, very detailed and granular on the very industry specific requirements. We have another one, GMP, Good Manufacturing Practice. GMP is different. So for AISC, you can get a accreditation for AISC from organizations who are accredited to issue those certifications. For ISO standards, same thing. Several third-party organizations that are accredited to certify you to those standards. API, same thing. API can come out and do the certification audit for you and get you those certifications. There's really no central body for GMP. So GMP is oftentimes more of a self-assessment than a third-party assessment. There are organizations that will conduct those audits, but it doesn't have the same international level of structure or organization that you find in these other standards. So we already mentioned AS9100. Again, this is for the aerospace model. It does get fairly granular, especially compared to 9001. And then probably the last big one to mention here is IATF 16949. Again, very, very similar to the 9001 standard, but the key difference here is that this is for the automotive industry. And then it has a lot of additional requirements for managing lower in that supply chain. So for 9001, for Q1, we really just want to monitor our supplier. We don't tend to care a whole lot about who their supplier is, too much about their history of the industry. We get to decide our selection criteria, and then we judge them against it. We're done and we're happy. IATF 16949 is a lot of numbers. You really got to dig deep into their supply chain. Who are they getting to provide the parts and services? And so it can get quite detailed and granular. But I hate to tell you, folks, as many as we have here, this is still just scratching the surface of what's available. So you really need to know the industry that you're in. I would say some general rules to follow is I have not yet met an organization that could not benefit from an ISO 9001 certification. I just don't think it happened. It's generic enough, it's bland enough, it's vanilla enough that you can apply it to almost any organization, from a church to a machine shop, electronics manufacturers, you name it. The other two of the big three, 14,001, 45,001, these can be applied in most organizations. Now, if you really don't have any waste other than the garbage can, okay, maybe 14,001 is not going to be a benefit, but they're generally implemented in any industrial facility. If you're working in the oil and gas world, you need API. I mean, that's it. Now, if you're working in the oil and gas world internationally, ISO 9001 once again becomes kind of the popular option to go to. If you're working in the aerospace world, we've got the AS9100 standard. But then again, we can get very granular into other smaller niche industries, and there's no shortage of standards out there. ISO even has another one for energy management, which is something we've been looking at, considering the push towards carbon neutral, the net zero, whatnot. But lots of options out there. So if you have any questions, anything you want to know, please put something in the comments below. Email me. I'd love to talk to you. So that's all I got today. Y'all have a great day.